12 men walked into a room arguing over who was the greatest. Their feet were filthy, their pride was worse, and not one of them would touch the basin. So why did Jesus, their teacher, their Lord, pick it up? Because the foot washing and the cross are the same story. One just uses water, the other uses blood. And if you do not understand what happened in that room, you do not fully understand what happened on that hill. To see it clearly, you need to know how dirty those feet actually were. The road into Jerusalem that week was packed dirt, not stone. Tens of thousands of Passover pilgrims had churned it into mud and dust. Add animal waste, add marketplace grime, add the sweat of a Judean spring. The sandals they wore were thin leather, open across the top, offering almost no protection. By the end of one day, feet were not just dusty, they were filthy. This is the detail almost everyone skips. 12 men walk into an upper room that evening. Their feet are still carrying every bit of that street. In a proper first-century home, feet like that were never left unattended. The moment a guest crossed the threshold, someone washed them before anyone reclined at the table. Because when you eat lying on your side, propped on one elbow, your feet end up level with everyone else's faces. Dirty feet at a meal were not a small lapse in manners. They were an insult to the host and to everyone else in the room. So somebody should be washing feet in that upper room. Nobody is. Most people know what happens next as a nice story about humility. Jesus grabs a towel, teaches a quiet lesson. Everyone feels a little more grateful. It is that, but it is something far heavier too. And almost no one sees the whole picture. In a few hours, this same man will be stripped, beaten, and nailed to a Roman cross. What he does with a basin of water in this room is not a separate story from what happens on that cross. It is the same story, told first in miniature, so that when the larger and harder version unfolds, the men watching him right now will already have the key to understand it. Tonight, we are going to walk through exactly what happens in that room, verse by verse. We are going to look at why no one else would touch that basin. We are going to look at exactly what Jesus knew about himself in the moment he picked up the towel. And we are going to look at the detail in this story that, once you see it, you will never read the Last Supper the same way again. To understand why this moment lands the way it does, you have to understand who was supposed to be holding that basin. Washing a guest's feet was universally understood as a servant's job. But it was not just any servant's job. Jewish teaching from this period held that the task was so low, so degrading, that a Hebrew servant could not even be required to perform it. If a household needed feet washed, that duty fell to the lowest person available, typically a Gentile slave, someone entirely outside the family's own standing and dignity. A wife might wash her husband's feet, a child might wash a parent's feet, but these were acts of devotion, offered freely, never obligations. As something you could be commanded to do, foot washing sat at the very bottom of the social ladder, beneath what one Israelite could be made to do for another. So when the 12 arrived at the upper room that Thursday evening, there was no servant waiting to do it. We know from Mark's and Luke's Gospels that the room had been arranged in advance. Peter and John were sent ahead to follow a man carrying a jar of water, an unusual enough sight that it worked as a signal, since carrying water was ordinarily a woman's task. He led them to a large, furnished room upstairs, but nothing in the text suggests a servant was present for the meal itself, which means, by the ordinary custom of the day, 12 pairs of tired, dusty feet were simply going to stay that way all night. And here is the detail that makes the scene almost unbearable once you notice it. Luke tells us that at this very meal, there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. 12 grown men sitting in a room with a job that desperately needed doing, arguing over which of them deserved the highest seat of honor. Nobody reaches for the basin, because reaching for the basin would mean admitting you were the lowest man in the room. Status was on the table that night, right alongside the bread and the wine, and it was in the middle of that exact argument that Jesus stood up. John frames what happens next with a weight he does not use anywhere else in his gospel. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. If you have read through John's Gospel from the beginning, that phrase should stop you. Because up to this point, John has told you the opposite, again and again. At the wedding in Cana, Jesus tells his mother, "My hour has not yet come." Later, when his enemies try to seize him, John notes that no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. For 13 chapters, the clock has been held back. Now, in this room, with a basin in his hands, John finally says it. The hour has come. That word end deserves a closer look, because in Greek, it is not simply a marker of time. The phrase is ais telos, to the goal, to completion. John is not just saying Jesus loved his disciples until the evening was over. He is saying that love reached its full intended measure. Nothing held back. And here is what should stop you cold. That same root word shows up again in John's Gospel in exactly one other place. On the cross, in John chapter 19, Jesus' final word is tetelestai. It is finished, brought to its goal, completed. Before the foot washing even begins, John is quietly telling you that the towel and the cross are one single act of love, reaching for the same finish line. But notice something else here, because it changes how you should read everything that follows. John tells us Jesus acted, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God. Jesus does not pick up the towel because he is uncertain of who he is, or because he has something to prove, or because someone forced him into a lower position. He picks it up knowing exactly who he is, the one who holds all things, who came from God, who is returning to God. This is not humility born out of low self-worth. It is humility that only someone completely secure in his own identity could afford. If you have ever believed that serving others, or being overlooked, would somehow diminish you, this is worth sitting with. The most secure person who has ever lived is the one who ties on the towel. But the Greek is only half the picture. In a few minutes, I am going to show you why Jesus washing Judas's feet is the most disturbing detail in the entire New Testament. Do not go anywhere. So Jesus rises from the table. John describes what happens with striking physical precision. He rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Picture it for a moment. The teacher, the one they have followed for 3 years, the one they have just called Lord, removes his outer robe in front of all 12 of them, wraps a servant's towel around his waist, the exact garment a Gentile slave would wear for this exact task. He kneels down, and one by one, he takes hold of feet that have walked through the filth of Jerusalem's streets all day, and he washes them with his own hands. Here is a detail most people never catch on a first reading. The Greek word John uses for Jesus laying aside his garments is the same word Jesus uses earlier in this gospel to describe laying down his own life. In chapter 10 he says, I lay down my life, that I may take it again. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. That is not a coincidence of vocabulary. It is a signature. When Jesus removes his robe to wash feet, John wants you to see a preview of him laying down his life completely on the cross. And a few verses later, when Jesus puts the robe back on and reclines at the table again, that is a preview, too, of resurrection, of taking his life back up. The foot washing is not a lesson tacked onto the side of Passion Week. It is the whole gospel, rehearsed in a small room with real water and a real towel before it happens for real outside the city walls. Jesus makes his way around the room, and eventually he comes to Simon Peter. Peter, who has never once been shy about saying exactly what he thinks, objects immediately. Lord, are you washing my feet? When Jesus tells him he does not yet understand what is happening but will understand later, Peter doubles down. You shall never wash my feet. In the Greek, that is about as strong a refusal as the language allows. Not just no, but never under any circumstance. You can understand why. Peter has spent 3 years watching this man heal the sick, calm storms, raise the dead. He has just called him Lord and Teacher. And now Lord and Teacher is on his knees in front of him with a basin of dirty water. It offends everything Peter believes about how the world is supposed to work. Kings do not wash the feet of fishermen. Jesus' answer is the hinge of the entire scene. If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. That word part, meros in the Greek, is not a casual word. It is the language of inheritance, of a shared portion, the kind of word used elsewhere in Scripture for belonging to God's own people. Jesus is telling Peter this was never about foot hygiene. It is about whether Peter will let himself be cleansed by a Savior who serves, or whether his pride will keep him standing at arm's length from grace itself. That single sentence flips Peter completely. Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus' reply draws a line most readers miss entirely. He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. 2 different Greek words are doing careful work in that sentence. One for a full bath, one for washing a smaller part of the body. Jesus is describing the difference between the once-for-all cleansing that comes the moment you trust him and the ongoing, daily washing you still need as you walk back out into a dusty world and pick up dirt along the way. You do not get saved over and over again, but you do keep needing your feet washed. Then John adds a line that should stop you cold. For he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, "You are not all clean." Judas Iscariot is sitting in that room. Judas has, according to Luke's gospel, already gone to the chief priests and agreed on a price, and Jesus knows it. He knows it while he is filling the basin. He knows it while he kneels down in front of him, and he washes Judas's feet anyway. The same hands, the same towel, the same patient, unhurried care he gives every other man in that circle. Peter thinks he is being respectful. He has no idea he is about to miss the entire point, and neither do we until we see what Jesus does next. If you have ever sat across a table from someone you knew was going to hurt you and still passed them the bread, you have felt a small fraction of what was happening in that room. Jesus does not skip Judas. He does not wash his feet with less care or add a private word of accusation under his breath. Grace is extended all the way to the edge, fully, even to a man who has already decided to reject it. When Jesus finishes, he puts his robe back on and returns to his place at the table. Then he asks them directly, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." Notice which two titles Jesus reaches for right before he flips the entire hierarchy of the room. Teacher, Lord, the two highest words the disciples had for him. He is not downplaying his authority to make a small point about humility. He is using the full weight of his authority to redefine what greatness actually looks like inside his kingdom. If the teacher and Lord washes feet, no one else in the room has standing to consider it beneath them. And this is where the towel connects directly to the cross a few hours later. The Apostle Paul, writing decades after this night, would describe Jesus in strikingly similar terms, a man who held full equality with God, yet refused to hold on to it, choosing instead the position of a servant, humbling himself all the way to a criminal's death on a cross. Paul never sat in that upper room, but he is describing, almost gesture for gesture, the exact posture John shows you with a basin and a towel. The foot washing and the cross are not two different lessons about Jesus. They are the same lesson, told twice, once in a small room with water, and once outside the city with nails. Centuries earlier, the prophet Isaiah had already painted this picture, describing a coming servant who would be despised, who would carry what was not his to carry, wounded for the sin of others, bringing healing through his own suffering. The king who kneels with a basin and the servant who bleeds on a hill are not two separate figures. They are the same person, showing you his character before he shows you his wounds. There is an even older pattern underneath all of this. In the wilderness tabernacle, God commanded the priests to wash their hands and feet at a bronze basin before they were allowed to enter his presence to serve. Washing was never only about cleanliness. It was preparation for priestly service. When Jesus washes his disciples' feet, he is quietly preparing ordinary fishermen and tax collectors to become, in Peter's own later words, a royal priesthood, a people who serve rather than merely receive. Remember that argument the disciples were having about who was the greatest? Jesus never answers it with a speech. He answers it with a basin, and the lesson lands so deeply that decades later, one of the men who was in that very room is still carrying it with him. In his first letter, the Apostle Peter writes to the church, "Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another." The Greek word he chooses there, egkombumai, is unusual. It does not simply mean putting on a coat. It specifically describes tying on a slave's apron, the exact kind of garment worn for menial labor. Of all the words available to him, Peter reaches for the one that pictures a servant's apron. He was there. He felt that towel against his own feet. He never stopped picturing it. Now here is where this stops being history and starts being about you. That is worth sitting with. This story did not stay in the upper room. It became the operating instructions for how the early church was supposed to treat one another. Not by rank, not by seniority or reputation or the loudest voice in the room, but by who was willing to reach for the towel. So ask yourself honestly who that is in your own life right now. Is there someone you have quietly decided is beneath your time, your patience, your service? A coworker, a family member, someone in your own church who never seems to pull their weight? Jesus did not wash the feet of people who deserved it. He washed the feet of men who, within hours, would abandon him, deny him 3 times, and in one case, sell him for silver. And he washed them anyway, on his knees, without a single word of resentment. So let's bring this all together. A room full of dusty, tired feet, and no servant to wash them. An argument about who deserved to be called the greatest. A teacher and Lord who lays aside his robe the same way he is about to lay aside his life. A single Greek word, telos, tying a basin in an upper room to a cross outside the city gate. A betrayer whose feet are washed with the same tenderness as everyone else's. And a church, decades later, still wearing that towel because one man who was in the room could never quite put the picture down. So what does this actually ask of you? First, it asks you to reconsider what real humility looks like. It is not thinking less of yourself. It is not shrinking or apologizing for taking up space or pretending you have nothing worth offering. Jesus picked up that towel from a position of complete security in who he was. Whatever you are asked to do this week that feels small or beneath you, you can do it the same way, not from weakness, but from a settled confidence in who you already are. Second, it asks you to look at whoever you are most tempted to write off and remember Judas's feet. Grace, in this story, is not reserved for people who have earned it or who are about to prove themselves faithful. It reaches all the way to the edge of betrayal and keeps going. That is a hard standard to live up to. It is also exactly the standard you were shown in full by the only person who has ever lived up to it himself. And maybe the part that stays with me most is this. Jesus knew everything that night, every betrayal coming, every denial, every disciple who would scatter into the dark within hours. And knowing all of it, he still knelt down. He still reached for feet that did not deserve to be touched by hands like his. That is not a footnote to the gospel. That right there, on his knees with a basin of dirty water, might be the clearest picture of the gospel you will ever see. 2,000 years later, the basin is empty and the water is long gone, but the towel is still being handed forward, one willing pair of hands at a time. So here is my question for you. Who is the Judas in your life right now? The person you do not think deserves your towel. Say their name in the comments, or just say, I needed this. Every comment tells YouTube to push this to someone else who is sitting in their own upper room tonight, arguing about who is greatest while the basin sits untouched. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. I will see you in the next one. Pray for us. God bless you.